Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us for this session. So as for the previous session, there will be a QR code, and if you want to ask your question that I will be able to see and address at the end of the session, you can scan it and send it directly. So today, we are here to discuss a topic that's been on everybody's mouth, which is scale. It's been a decade now that the ecosystem has been building up ways for tech transfer to bring labs and innovation towards market. And today, as it was highlighted by the Draghi report, we're in a good position, especially, for instance, in Europe, but we have way more to do. So between R&D investment, growth capital, new regulation harmonization, talent attraction and retention, I think the public roadmap is starting to get clearer, but what we wanted to discuss today is what should founders do? When you're in this stage of scaling and you have so many questions to address and so many challenges, why and how should you look at them? So we have an amazing panel today that is representing both the public, the private, and the investment sector. And I want to start by having Constantijn introducing himself.
Oh, thank you. Oh, this is loud. I lead an organization called Techleap. We support scaling companies in the Netherlands. And we have a specific emphasis on deep tech companies that are slightly early stage, but we help them through programs and the community. And we will eventually also be raising a fund.
Thanks, Constantijn. Michiel?
My name is Michiel Scheffer. I'm Dutch, and I'm president of the board of the EIC. And the EIC is, let's say, the venture arm of the European Commission. So we are funding and also supporting the ecosystem of deep tech startups and scale-ups.
Thank you, Michiel. Fabien?
So morning, everyone. Thanks, Alizé. Thanks, Hello Tomorrow, for inviting me to this panel. I'm Fabien Desord. I'm head of strategic partnerships for L'Oréal. As the leading beauty company in the world, we are committed to sustainable innovation, and to innovate sustainably, we have to partner. So we partner with a growing number of startups, especially in the area of biotech and green chemical technologies, to develop the next generation of beauty products.
Maria?
Thanks for having me, and great to be here. So my name is Maria Vasasharna. I'm one of the founding partners of Quanted Ventures. Quanted is the first Nordic pure-play industrial tech VC firm. And our mission is really to accelerate the industrial transformation. We invest in early-stage industrial tech, deep tech startups across Northern Europe. Great to be here.
Thank you, guys. So as you see, we will have different perspective, and that's actually what we need, because the scale stage will really require the whole ecosystem to take action. So the first thing I want to start discussing is the regulatory part. So we know deep tech, it's science, so you have a lot of industry standards, you have labels, regulatory pathways, and that's often a hurdle for companies not only getting started, but then growing, expanding to new geographies, having to comply with all of those things, spend their money that they just raised on it, wait a lot of time to get approved. What could we do to ease that process? And maybe, Maria, we can start by your perspective. I know you were a former lawyer.
Yes, that's right. I have a past as a former lawyer for 15 years. I was working with business law, so M&A, compliance, lots of regulatory issues as well. So this is an interesting discussion for me from that perspective too. But I think first of all, before diving deeper, I think it's important to sort of remember the definition of deep tech, because it's become a bit of a hype and a cool thing, which also makes it vague. And I think we need to remember what we're talking about, because that also sort of really gives a framework for the discussion. So I mean, it's really about new scientific breakthroughs and innovations that really give solutions to profound societal challenges. And there's a bit of a misconception, in my view, that deep tech is always higher risk. But I think it's sometimes forgotten that it's perhaps gradually de-risked over time compared to other kinds of cases. And what is deep tech at some point in time is maybe mainstream soon. So it's also very much an evolving definition. And I think with the risk profile, good to also sort of remember that the risk lies most in perhaps team and technology and less in competition and market, which is also a great aspect of the whole space in my view. But perhaps I sort of stop there before going further and giving some views on the, what we can do about the regulation and governance aspect, maybe drawing from the previous panel that talked about also the Draghi report. So I think there's much to be discussed in that aspect there.
Thank you. And I know, Michel, so obviously from the EIC, you have a lot of perspective looking at the whole region of Europe where regulation might not be harmonized, but where we can do many new things to support the startup scaling in the region.
Yeah, we look at regulation in 3 dimensions. One is the regulation linked to setting up or scaling up a company. There are huge differences in the speed of, let's say, setting up a company. In Estonia, it's a matter of days. In some other countries, it's a matter of months, because you have a tax number before you have, let's say, the legal things done. And one of the clues to that is the 28 regime to speed up the system by having, let's say, an EU corporate status. So that's one thing. That's urgent. So we hope that the Commission will come with a solution in 12 to 18 months. That's fast in Europe. The second thing is a single market. So you need markets that promote innovation. And that's a mix of, let's say, creating barriers for the newcomers, that the newcomers are protected against the incumbents. And it's also deregulating for enabling more experimentation. And there the problem is that the Novel Food Directive is basically hampering innovation. It takes too long to get, let's say, something accepted. And the problem is that also, it's not in the regulation, but often in the lack of knowledge of the regulator of giving authorizations. So it takes too long. And the third one is the building permitting, or let's say, and we have in the EIC a lot of first-of-a-kind installations. So there's no history of a similar installation. So there as well, sometimes it takes 3 to 5 years for a startup to get a permit to build a factory. A startup is bankrupt by 5 years. Huh? So we had to speed up that. And a very legal point to it, a lot of regulation in Europe over the last 20 years has been in the form of directives. So it means there's an overall framework, and each member state, and in some member states each region, implements it in their way. So in Baden-Württemberg is different than in Schleswig-Holstein, and different than in Denmark or in Austria. And one of the things is the European Union should work more with regulation, which is basically it's the same everywhere. That's very contentious, but because some countries feel they do better themselves, but we have to move, especially because of the US, to stronger European harmonized systems.
Can I quickly just comment on that, because it's such an excellent last point you make, that it's not just about the difference or the regulations in the different countries, but their enforcement. And that's something that was mind-boggling as a lawyer, that the same law was enforced in very different ways across EU nations, depending on the agency, authority, the official. I mean, that creates a lot of uncertainty in the markets.
Yeah, I think for a company to depend on regulation is suicide. So because it will always take too long. So if you have a business model that depends on regulatory norm setting, for instance, the shift in energy sources or bio-based economy kind of interventions, then probably you're going to be disappointed because regulation comes too late in your business, you're running out of money. So I would always advise not to bet on that. Regulation can also be a moat, so it can be actually a competitive moat if you manage to deal with it effectively, especially in Europe. So you have to look at it, I think, in a strategic way. When you look at it from the side of the regulator, I think I mean, like in the European Commission, you have the impact assessment system. So you have to actually look what a future regulation has, how it impacts on different sectors of the economy, of society, and on the environment. And there has to actually be some kind of a innovation test that you don't have collateral damage out of the regulations that are been introduced. For instance, GDPR was introduced when we weren't talking about AI. And we have very big difficulties actually adjusting it again. We have the medical devices regulation, which is completely killing innovation in that space in Europe. And there's very little ways that we can actually kind of revert back to the original regulator and say, well, this is not working anymore. So that's something I think we would definitely need to introduce. And maybe a last point, and we're ready to discuss this when we're standing back there. I'm very inspired by India that has developed a digital stack that created interoperability, security, privacy, and all that by design. And anyone who wants to build a company can actually use the different components on identity, KYC, payments, etc., from this public-private stack. And it means that you're actually engineering instead of regulating. Whereas in Europe, we're always kind of regulating ex post. So there has to be some disruption of the internal market for the European Commission to harmonize regulations and set standards. And then you're always too late. So you want to be proactive and visionary to actually be able to create some digital infrastructures for Europe. So engineer, don't regulate, I would say.
Michiel, I see you want to react.
Just to add, I mean, for the EIC, we have 706 companies we are supporting now. 90% of them are in highly regulated markets. Health, energy,
food,
for example. And well, regulation has a good reason. It's to protect the patient, to protect a 99.99 efficient energy system without breakages. So I say all startups have to integrate regulation in their thinking. Doing as if it is not existing doesn't help. On the other side, please call me if you see barriers that you see unfair. We have as a board, since a month now, the duty also to signal to the Commission, let's say, odd barriers. And we also have a role to inform you, help you. So please link in and connect to me when you have practical complaints.
You're going to be overflown with messages.
I hope so. I hope so, because then I get more stuff.
Thank you, guys. And I think so we just discussed heavily the side of the regulator, but Fabien, indeed, I want to go to you because as industrial, you're used to the standards. I mean, you comply with them all the time. And sometimes I think part of the barrier for startups is not being able to understand fully all the regulation, what they should do or not do. How could you guys be a bridge maybe between the regulator and the startups?
From a corporate perspective, at L'Oréal, we understand that for startup, regulatory compliance is a challenge. Of course, the technology, they understand it better than anybody else, but the market, the regulation, it's very difficult to expect them to understand very well. So at L'Oréal, we believe that we have a responsibility to help the startup we partner with to understand, to get them to understand, to navigate the very complex regulatory landscapes, which varies from one country, from one region to another. So what do we do concretely? Well, we'll brief them. We'll get them to meet our subject experts to onboard them. And more generally, we'll do whatever we can to make sure that the solution, the technology they are developing, is compliant with regulations. And by the way, same applies to safety.
Thank you. And indeed, I think, I mean, the collaboration on those topics, and we've seen also collaboration among startups to try and push new regulation into sandboxes in a few countries, is quite important to slow, or quicken actually the slow pace of those regulations. So when we're talking about regulation, another topic that was brought up by the Draghi report is, you know, when you're looking at big corporations and they're trying to grow, they're going through organic growth, but also M&A. And it's something that's maybe preventing our scaling startups to also become champions because the M&A regulation and the trade regulation are not very adapted to them. So, Maria, I wanted to touch upon that point with you. Based on, again, the recommendation from the Draghi report, what do you think we should do on that front?
I definitely see that there's potential to advance and encourage creating European champions. What the Draghi report underlines is actually nothing new. I was in my previous life working a lot with EU competition policy and merger control. And for me, it was also always very troublesome to understand why or Brussels was prohibiting some mergers to protect consumers and to protect innovation, when today the discussion is really about dependability and becoming vulnerable because we don't have these big companies. And I still recall when European Commission prevented the Alstom-Siemens merger to create a European champion to rival against China in the railway sector. And that, of course, made Germany and France very angry, and there was this movement in EU competition policy that we need to change the rules. This just doesn't work, especially when we look at US antitrust rules, which are implemented very leniently, and for example, big tech can make these killer acquisitions. So I've been looking at this development for a longer time, feeling like a bit frustrated. So I think it's very much now good to get this urgency from the Draghi report, which is actually also echoed in the State of European Tech report by Atomico. If you read it, there's many similarities in what Draghi is underlining in the State of the European Tech report, which really points to competition policy and merger rules needing to be changed. Maybe one thing to add, and then I'll invite my fellow panelists to comment on this topic, that with the geopolitical landscape, I think there's also a little bit of reason to think how does it all come together when you start planning exits, because there's going to be increased scrutiny by governments if there's an acquisition interest for, let's say, a critical or strategic technology which is closely tied to national security. And I mean, if you look now at the situation of European deeptech startups, I mean, usually they're bought up by US corporations or big tech companies like Meta and Apple and so on. So how is this going to be evolving with the, let's say, rise of defense tech, deep tech companies? That's going to be interesting.
Constantijn?
Yeah, I think we really have a challenge with exits in Europe. So we see very little IPO activity and not a lot of M&A activity either. And it has to be a good mix. So I would think, and maybe you can respond to that as well, but that our European companies should be much more active also in corporate venturing. So not only investing, but also sharing their facilities and collaborating, but also acquiring companies. For many companies, by far the best exit is to actually, to exit through an M&A process. And we're not seeing a lot of that. And then eventually there will be they will go through a lot of troubles in raising new funds, and they won't be able to raise new funds. And then it's usually American companies that then acquire them for the technology. So exits there is a big issue. And the second point is that our startups are not very themselves not very active in acquiring other companies and through buy and build strategies. And I think especially in the different markets in Europe, if you want to grow faster, you have to also have acquisition as one of the tools alongside organic growth. And our investors should actually stimulate that, and that's not happening that much. And therefore, they grow slower, they have less firepower, and they become more vulnerable to takeovers.
I just want to note that point because it's quite important, the mindset piece. So there's also the regulation we just discussed, but the mindset of going and not just doing organic growth, but acquisition from the investors and from the entrepreneurs is going to be fundamental in the success of that piece of the scaling journey. Michiel, you wanted to react?
Yeah, I recognize that all the points that Constantijn is raising. I feel a bit from our portfolio that the corporates in Europe are 20 years behind the Americans. Also, all focusing on their core activities, and most CVCs have smaller size than 20 years ago, with some great examples of the wrong choices. And for us, we invest, let's say, 5 to 10 years in companies, so the exiting is not yet an issue, but it's becoming one, because we have three problems. The IPO market in Europe is not very good, the CVCs are not very good, and we have limitations in, let's say, in our own portfolio of promoting mergers or acquisitions inside what we fund. And that's going to become a challenge. One comment on Draghi, for everyone here, it's not a shopping mall, huh? It's not you can choose things, I like this. No, everything of Draghi has to happen. We have no longer the luxury of being selective, especially not since the 20th of January.
Thank you, Michiel. So, one other element that Constantijn just started to introduce is definitely financing scale. And the thing is, in the earlier stages of the startup journey, they rely a lot, of course, on VC money, public money. When you're coming to the scale stage, you need to do blended finance. You need to diversify the sources of the money you're getting because you need to build your factories, honor your orders, hire senior people. So you're at that crucial turnover point where your expenses are going up. What's the good mix? What type of source of financing between corporate venturing that was mentioning, of course, VC money, maybe public money, banks as well, should we see in our scale-ups? Michiel, do you want to start?
Well, I often use the valley of death as a metaphor, and I do this consciously. I always stop earlier than the top. So the big problem we have is the last part. It's a bit different in Europe. In Eastern Europe, there's still a problem here. But let's say in Northwestern Europe, the problem is there. But you don't address this without having addressed this part. So it's a kind of a work of convincing, seducing investors into the system, and they get more aware of it if they have already funded this one. So for the EIC, the big challenge is now to develop partners to enable tickets of above 100 million euros. We are still now below that. And that's basically a constant work of engaging with institutional investors and to have them look in the portfolio and to see that within that portfolio there is a section they can, with less risk, invest into it. So you need a very segmented approach. And I think that, for example, in sustainable energy, that's a good sector to start with. But it's really working, developing the ecosystem. And that is a work of at least 20 years. But we don't have that time. Yeah. Since the 20
Well, it's very hard to find funds that can do 100 million, because most funds will not invest 10% of the fund into one investment. So the funds will have to be multiple billion funds, which we really don't have in Europe. So there's of course the ETSI, I don't think ETSI initiative to grow those kind of funds, but it'll take some time. I think governments can do much more with guarantees to allow actually banks financing, and so debt financing as well. In these when companies need to scale in that part of that Michiel was talking about. We're talking a lot, of course, about the first of a kind facilities. There's also philanthropy money that is available for that. So you will unavoidably in Europe work with a kind of a blended finance to be able to fund that, because very often it's still pre-revenue, and for regular VC it becomes a very unattractive and still very risky investment. So, but governments can be very supportive through guarantees or kind of co-investments. I think there's a lot of action now to get pension funds more involved in this, and governments can ensure that there is a fixed return for those pension funds, so there are other ways to incentivize private investors to actually step into the market in that phase of investment.
Thanks, Constantijn. And indeed, I think, so the value of this, we all talk about it. There's a lot of talk around the funding part. Sometimes the value of this is coming for you, not because you're not getting the funding, but because you're not spending it the right way. And I think that's always a dilemma for entrepreneurs that are at that stage, between continuing R&D for new innovation or scaling their proven products. So maybe, Fabien, I want to turn to you. What advice would you give to founders that are now at that stage? Okay, they've secured the funding, but they're navigating this. I don't know if it's a dilemma, but at least this question.
Yeah, I think it's often a make or break balancing act for startups. So while investing in R&D in longer term opportunities is something they need to do to survive and be successful in the longer term, they also need to have some quick wins, as we call it internally, because they need to demonstrate very early on that they have a path to generate revenues. So they need to have a mix of very quick wins, as we call them, and then longer-term opportunities. As a corporate, we understand that, and when we work with startups, and I think startups need to insist on that, we need to not only work on the most very exciting, very disrupting longer-term solutions that they're developing, but also what we could do in the shorter term so they can start to generate revenues. And for a corporate, it's also very important because internally we'll be asked, okay, you've got that partnership, when is it going to deliver? So it's important to be able to deliver quickly.
And sorry, just one thing to add. We had a conversation yesterday, round table with especially quantum companies, and it was interesting to see Alice and Bob raising 100 million, and the Dutch companies were all mentioning that because of the financial situation, they went to revenue generating really early on. So it was hard to kind of think that big. If you looked at PsiQuantum, for instance, that is raising a billion actually in Australia and the US. These are the same kind of companies, but it's a different mindset and a different kind of funding culture that determines their pace. And one of the issues that came up there was also how governments fund research. And you can either do that as a subsidy program, which is relatively incremental, or you can do it as a procurement program, which is more like happens in the US. And that's actually a very interesting model, because if you can procure for 1 billion, a big installation, a lot of companies will actually will contribute, and they're very focused on the market. Basically, you've already got a client, and it might, the machine might never even materialize, but in that you have financed a lot of startups that are actually moving towards a marketable product, whereas subsidy is very kind of open-ended and will not deliver the same kind of market focus. So thinking much more as from a procurement perspective about how to fund research is something that we should do more of in Europe, I think.
Michiel?
Yeah, I totally support this. And we have interesting examples. For example, the French army is developing a new high-power computer, and I think they use 18 of our beneficiaries as co-suppliers of that system. That's as important than our subsidies. Another example is sitting here. We have companies we fund in Earth observation that work with the suppliers of your suppliers. But because you ask for, let's say, transparency and traceability of the supply chain, we have startups we can fund that know there is ultimately a client for that. So the recently postponed CSRD regulation is a very important regulation to foster the scale-up of innovation.
Indeed, and part of the things we were discussing with preparing is the importance of sales, of this procurement from the public and from the private sector. So I know there's many more initiatives now to try to ease the public procurement for startups, because of course it's big markets, so you want to secure people that will provide and answer those markets. So I know the French Tech, for instance, just announced an academy to help startups understand how to answer those public tenders so that the public sector become also one of the early clients of the startup, and it doesn't only rely on the private sector. So Michiel, anything else that you've seen across Europe to facilitate also the access of public procurement for scale-ups?
Yeah, so the two things we promote as EIC is one is called Corporate Days, so to connect startups to larger companies. We had one day with L'Oréal, so we do that about 12 times a year. We could do more, but we have limited capacities. So one is these corporate days to connect, to create the ecosystem, and the other one, that's tougher, to get, let's say, public authorities to foster innovative procurement and to give more balance to the points than to the price. So that's really needed to develop that. So the two are important to do. And what is also important is that we have only few countries that are large enough, let's say, to be a procurer. So we have also to federate smaller countries to buy the same standards. There, a European Defence Union will be of great help, because it will be, let's say, the next step. But we need it in more markets, whether it's railways, construction, automotive, to, let's say, pool to single standards. And of course, Europe being a standard maker, it's also an important thing to do.
Thank you, Michel. So indeed, public, yes.
Yeah, there's just one thing I want to add for startups. There's an important element that startups don't understand well enough is project financing. So once you have, let's say, your first of a kind, you have to use other funding instruments like project funding, factoring. So using your client's portfolio to fund, let's say, your innovation and your scaling up.
Thank you.
The EIB is doing a lot in that.
So I want to go now to, indeed, Fabien, you, because, okay, we discussed public procurement, but it's true that in the private sector, we hear a lot about proof of concept with industrial players, and a little less about at-scale projects, at least with earlier stage startup and not SMEs. So how do you guys approach those bigger scale projects, and how do you make sure that you build a win-win situation for the industrial players, but also for the startups?
Yeah, you're right. So scaling up for startup is a major challenge, and we realize this at L'Oréal. I mean, the last startup I worked for just has gone under before Christmas. While their manufacturing plan was 80% completed, so it is tough. So we do realize that, and we've been thinking quite a lot about how we could go around this challenge. And we're continuing to change our ways of working, our engagement models, to help startups de-risk this critical phase of the journey. So, for example, we have in the technology space, we have scale-up experts within L'Oréal. So we work with partners. We systematically now bring them on board to help them de-risk that. We also, innovation, ingredient innovation space. We have a subsidiary at L'Oréal which manufacture ingredients. We also have a number of suppliers worldwide that are manufacturing ingredients for us. And we believe that one key option is to plug some of these startups with these partners that have their capabilities to scale up. They have stack of expertise in biotech, in green chemical technologies to scale up these processes and then manufacture at scale because they also have the industrial assets. So for example, last year, and that was the first for us, we've launched a tripartite alliance between a biotech, a very innovative biotech startup called Panelists, and then one of our ingredient supplier called Evonik in Germany. It's a global specialty chemical manufacturer, and we've set up the alliance to do exactly that. So Abolis, the startup, they can focus on their core expertise, which is about developing microorganisms, developing strains, developing processes at lab scale. Evonik then pick up the process, scale it up, industrialize it, and manufacture the ingredients that are developed through that tripartite for L'Oréal. And L'Oréal is the venture client, to take the term you used earlier on, in the beauty sector. Another advantage of that is that Evonik is present in many verticals. So they sell product in many sectors. So potentially the ingredients that are coming through the pipeline could then be sold in other sectors. So again, helping achieve greater economies of scale, de-risking the scaling up for the startup and all the parties involved. And in these specific cases, we talked about CVC earlier on, so L'Oréal has a venture capital fund called BOLDS, and we, with the VC fund of Evonik, we co-invested in that startup in our bodies to, again, further support that startup and the tripartite alliance that we are trying to do. So this is kind of it's an example of the sort of engagement models that we're trying to put in place to help de-risk the scaling up of startups.
And I like this example because you're kind of guaranteeing the order for the project to take life, but then the win situation for your customer and for the startup could be even bigger because they could expand to other customers. So that's, I think, a real win-win example. Maria, you wanted to react?
I wanted to quickly actually continue a discussion we had backstage because we were then interrupted by moving here. But I think it was interesting. We were talking about that in your engagement with startups and your collaboration, sometimes you feel that the startups should even demand for more and sort of stand up for themselves. So thinking about this question in light of maybe advice for startups, what are the questions they're not asking, or where are they not pushing enough, you feel?
Well, I think as we discussed earlier on, I think from day one, what I see working with a lot of startups and coming from the startup world is that sometimes they're shy to be asking what our expectation, what can we expect from the partnership? How big is the market? How big is the size of the pie? And often they might make some assumptions, or they might not dare to ask, but they need to. And I think as a corporate, sometimes we also probably not very good at telling them, or not very proactive, and I think we need to do so, and startups need to keep challenging. Sometimes they might get a no, or they might not get an answer, but they need to keep asking these questions. Because in the end, we need win-win, and we need to be very clear what the startup can expect, what the corporate can expect as well.
I love when the panelists are making it easy for me, because that's actually my final question to you guys. What are the tips?
Do we do audience questions as well?
For now, there's none.
Okay, so maybe the audience, there's a QR code. So the idea is that you can make this more interactive. So if you want to ask questions, you have to do that through the QR code.
So while you guys can and send the question out, that I'm keeping an eye on it, tips that you could give to founders that are in this critical stage on how they should approach the journey ahead of us?
Well, in many of the companies we're working with, the ones that are very successful have actually attracted very good advisors around them, or independent board members that help them also protect their interest against some of the VC board members that might just have a fiduciary duty. So invest money in getting experts, industry experts on either as advisors or on your team. That would be one. Second, and also international. Don't just shop around in your own ecosystem, but if you need to expand internationally, try to get international on board soon. The second is also hiring people. So hire for growth. As a startup, of course, you're hiring for technology in the beginning, and then eventually maybe hire for sales and stuff. But at a certain point, you need real deep industrial expertise on your executive team. And you have to do that in a timely manner. So maybe hire beyond your current level, because you're hiring for growth, and it's allowed to cost money.
Thanks, Constantijn. Michiel?
Well, just to add, because this is all very true, two things we see in our portfolio: stage gate well, so don't scale up too early when your prototype is not proven. And the other thing is, don't have the BMW syndrome. Don't come with a 2 series, 3 series, 5 series, 7 series. Focus on something that generates revenues, and then develop, let's say, other varieties. And also with connections with corporates, be cautious in doing things for nothing. Thinking, well, I work together with a big corporate, and ultimately they will buy my stuff, and then I will get millions. No. Also discuss to get paid for testing. Or not, absolutely. But make a conscious choice on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so absolutely agree with your point about the skills. Having worked in startups, I always heard from investors, and I'm sure you'd agree, is that the team is as, if not more important than the technology. So that's a key point. See large corporates like the likes of L'Oréal as a way to access market, to get to scale, as we discussed earlier on. But as you said, I think it's very important when you work with corporates that you make sure that your solution responds to a top priority. It's not a nice to have, because otherwise you'll get nowhere. And think at scale from day one. Don't scale too fast, but think at scale from day one. Do technical economic analysis very early on. I hear often that we don't have enough data, it's too early to do some techno-economics. You can do some back of the envelope calculation very quickly to make sure that sometimes, if it's way off, there's no point spending time and resources on some applications. And again, last line is network, network, network. Use this sort of events to meet partners, to meet investors, to meet consultants. Again, very important. It might seem expensive, but sometimes investors, consultants, they will help you unlock some things that will take you a long time. So if you hire the good ones, they will be worth every cent.
Maria?
Hard to add anything to this list. I agree with all comments. For me, I think it really boils down to building the tier one team. So early stage, taking on board the right VC, so smart capital, trust capital, that there's industrial networks behind, and doors can really be opened for you, for pilots, for potential customers. And then I think the point about creating an international advisory board, or just having the right advisors around is really key. And I think here I would really encourage also the younger entrepreneurs, like, assume people want to help. Like, assume people really, they want to give you a bit of their time. So don't be shy, really reach for that best person that you admire and have been following, even though you don't know them from before, because that's at least my experience. People with expertise they want to share.
Thank you guys so much. So I think we've learned a couple of things on how both regulators, maybe corporations, but also entrepreneurs can approach scale. And actually, I want to take this opportunity to announce an initiative that will be taking all of this recommendation together, but also maybe your recommendation as ecosystem builders. So there will be the Danish presidency of the EU next year. And as we are going towards the EU Innovation Act, that will be a critical milestone in enabling more scale-ups into Europe, we will have an initiative led by the Technical University of Denmark and Hello Tomorrow called Ascend, where we will run interviews and workshops with ecosystem builders, but with entrepreneurs as well, to really go from the Draghi report, but build how to come to life. So what are the things we need to do, who needs to do them, and how do we put that in the EU Innovation Act? So if you have ideas, if you want to participate, there will be many opportunities across the summer, and then a conference that will be taking place in November that will ultimately lead to 2 reports being given to the EU for this act to be meaningful and to make a difference for scale-ups in Europe. So thank you guys for sharing with all of our audience your knowledge, and I wish you all a good lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.